what is going on in Ann Arbor, Michigan, who is involved, and what punishments does the university face? These are all questions that I've asked myself these past few weeks or so since the news broke. And today I hope to provide a comprehensive analysis of all three of those questions and deliver a somewhat definitive answer. So with the intro out of the way, I'd like to say hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I'm your host, as always, Nathan, and today we're going to be breaking down the so-called sign stealing scandal. Before we actually get into the content of this video, there's some stuff here that I want to talk about before we get into everything. And as you can see on the screen, I'm not playing around with this stuff. The first thing, first and foremost, is if you are not here for a civil and rational conversation, then flat out and straight up go fuck yourself and get out of here. I'm not playing around with you. If you're just going to be the type of person that goes into the comment section and types cope and then that's it, go fuck yourself. You're not providing any sort of anything to this conversation. You're just being an asshole for no reason. The next thing is that, yes, I am a Michigan fan, but I have no bias when talking about college football or anything in general. None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. If you try to tell me I'm biased or implicitly biased, you are going to lose that argument because I am going to go harder after Michigan than anybody has so far in this video. I'm going to break down potential legal proceedings. I'm going to talk about how the NCAA rules and the Big Ten rules actually work and tell you flat out and straight up that Michigan broke several NCAA rules. However, at the same time, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like everything that is on the table reportedly is actually on the table, because that is not true. There are some things that are just not going to happen. And we'll discuss both of those things later on in the video. But we have to move on to this next thing here, which I think is probably the most important piece of this video here. If Jim Harbaugh didn't know what was going on inside his own program, he will still be held responsible for it. But acting like he should have known is flat out and straight up absurd, okay? The Michigan football team probably has north of 300 employees, plus 150 kids to look after. So this is a 500-person size company. If you think Jim Harbaugh knows exactly what everybody is doing inside his football program, you're clinically insane and you cannot be helped. What happened here is that Jim hired Connor Stalions to steal signs, okay? Then Connor Stalions went and stole signs in a matter that is certainly an NCAA violation. However, Jim Harbaugh's not looking over his goddamn shoulder. Think about it. If you are a manager at some gas station or whatever the shit, and you tell somebody to go clean the bathroom, are you going to actually look over their shoulder while they're cleaning the bathroom, or are you going to do something else? No. When they tell you that they've finished, you're going to go look at their work and decide if they did a good job or not. And that's exactly what happened here. Connor Stalions presented Jim Harbaugh with his finished product, which is stolen signs, and then Jim Harbaugh said, yo, this is good work, and then that was the end of the conversation. I mean, this is a case of the phrase, ignorance is no excuse for the law, to a T, pretty much, in my opinion. Jim Harbaugh will still be punished for this, even if he didn't know about it, which, according to everything that we have publicly available at the moment, he didn't know about it. And the fact that he didn't know about it has no credence on the NCAA investigation, but it could have an effect on the upcoming court hearing on Friday against the Big Ten. The last thing that I want to talk about here, and this was more of a thing like 2 or 3 weeks ago, but I still want to talk about it. But this scandal, at least what is publicly known, is not worse than Spygate. In Spygate, Bill Belichick directly ordered a staff member of the New England Patriots to film opposing sidelines during the game that he was playing against them in. Then he would use those signs for the next time that they played to figure out what they were doing on offense and defense. No allegation against Michigan would have any kind of impact on the game like what that does. They're similar. This is probably 85 to 90% of Spygate, but Spygate is still way worse because you're creating a video record of the opposing team's signs against you and your looks. So that's worse than what Michigan is doing, okay? And I'm not going to compare cross sports here because I don't think you can do that. So if you want to bring up the Astros, go for it. I don't think you can compare baseball to football. Okay, let's move on and get into the actual issue now, starting off with some context for all of this stuff here. And the first thing we have to bring up is that sign stealing is not against NCAA rules. This has been beaten to death. Everybody should probably know that by now, okay? A lot of teams, pretty much every high-ranking team in college football, has a dedicated coach whose job it is to steal signs. That's not a big deal. What also isn't a big deal is the fact that an investigative firm gave information to the NCAA. That's entirely irrelevant. The fact that a private investigation firm gave information to the NCAA that kickstarted this investigation, that doesn't matter at all. Like literally 0%. Full stop. It doesn't matter. That being said, who hired the firm is potentially important. And that's really only important when it comes to the actual punishments of this, because the NCAA might not want to set the precedent that hiring an investigative firm, if it was in fact a college football program or a college football coach that hired them to dig up dirt on Michigan, the NCAA might not want to set the precedent that that is okay to do. However, that could very easily not affect the punishment of Michigan at all, and the NCAA could then just make a rule saying that you can't hire a private investigative firm to go and dig up dirt on other teams. The last thing I'm going to do here is that I'm going to name names in terms of programs that steal signs. Programs that I am very confident steal signs and do it at a high level. Those include Michigan, Ohio State, Rutgers, Indiana, Purdue when Jeff Brom was there, Clemson, Oklahoma, Georgia, and Oregon under Dan Lanning. Teams that attempt to steal signs and are somewhat decent at it, but will still look to trade with other teams or to get any sort of advantage that they can from stealing signs. Those include Illinois, Northwestern, Maryland, Minnesota, Penn State, Alabama, and Florida under Dan Mullen. It's also worth noting that Wisconsin also likely steals signs because it was fairly well known that Luke Fickell did it at Cincinnati, and it's also fairly likely that Louisville also steals signs now that Jeff Brom is their coach. As far as teams that don't steal signs, the only three that I could particularly find any sort of information on where pretty much everybody said they don't steal signs were Michigan State under Mel Tucker, Iowa under Kurt Ferentz, and Nebraska under Matt Rule. And if you're wondering where I got this information, it's from watching a ton of insider type of videos on YouTube and reading a crap load of insider articles on the internet from various different teams. But I'm going to specifically shout out Michigan insider Isaiah Hull for sort of setting me off on this journey by giving me the rundown on all 13 other Big Ten teams and whether or not they steal signs inside the Big Ten. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about how it works. How does the micro of stealing signs work? What is Connor Stalions actually doing when he's setting out to steal signs? And the answer to that is a normal sign stealer would use all 22 film angles and potentially broadcast angles and anything that they can find on the internet that shows the sideline to figure out what signals are being sent into a play, and then figuring out what play was run, when it was in the quarter, etc., etc., etc. And then you match all of that up, you create a database of that, so that when the game is actually played, you can cross-reference what those signs mean in the game and what play is going on, and then see if you actually have that sign or not. When they figure out that they do have one of the signs, when that sign is being used, they will then whisper into the offensive or defensive coordinator, most of the time the defensive coordinator's ear, and tell them what they think the sign means, so that the defensive coordinator can then make a play call that makes sense for what they think is going to be the play. And that sounds like an incredible advantage until you remember that teams can very easily either not use signs and huddle or change the signs. It's also worth noting that it's kind of hard to argue that Michigan had a competitive advantage when 11 of the 14 Big Ten teams steal signs and almost all of them share them with each other. And where Connor Stallions gets into a gray area is the fact that he wasn't just using all 22 film or broadcast angles or shit he found on the internet. He was sending an advanced scout to a game in order to record their signals, so he had 100% of them throughout the entire game. And that is definitively an advantage. I'm not sure how much of an advantage that it could be, because you could argue that if other teams were getting Michigan signs using the normal methods, then there wasn't particularly an advantage for Michigan at all. And you could also argue that Michigan, because they have 100% of the signs on the sideline, that they'd be able to decipher them quicker and then be able to compare them with other data in order to figure out basically what is going on like 100% of the time. But what is the actual technical NCAA violation? And that is NCAA Rule 1-11-H, which states any attempt to record either through audio or video means any signal given by an opposing player, coach, or other team personnel is prohibited. That seems pretty black and white, pretty concrete, right? Well, not particularly, because the way that this is structured is the NCAA has Rule 1, subsection 11, which then has several different things in it, and this is the subsection of the subsection titled H. Now, the first subsection, 11, is titled The Game, Field, Players, and Equipment, which is defined as everyone in the team area, players, substitutes, replaced players, coaches, athletic trainers, cheerleaders, band members, mascots, public address announcers, audio, video, lighting system operators, and other persons affiliated with the teams or institutions. And in case there's any confusion about what it means by the teams or institutions, the teams is defined in Rule 1-1-1-A, which tells us that the game shall be played between two teams of not more than 11 players each. And if you've been on Michigan Twitter, you've probably heard that this means that we're talking about the two teams that are playing a given game, not all Division I teams everywhere in college football at that specific point in time. And for this rule to apply, the person must be affiliated with one of the teams playing the game and in a team area, which Rule 1-2-4-A defines as being on each side of the ball, in the back of a limit line, and in between the 20-yard lines. Basically, it's what I've always referred to as the coach's box. So in order to be subject to Rule 1-11-H, you have to be on the sideline of the field in the coach's box. And people who are watching in the stands are not there, right? Well, maybe. If I'm being honest with you, while that's not as big of a reach as some people might say, it is still a reach, and it would take a whole lot of convincing in order to get a judge or someone else to believe that. Let's go back to Rule 1-11-H, which once again is defined as any attempt to record either through audio or video means any signal given by an opposing coach, player, or other team's personnel is prohibited. The key word in that definition is opposing, and the NCAA could easily argue, if necessary in a court of law, that since Michigan is a future opponent of the team that they're recording, they are an opposing team. But you still would have to be on the field in order for that to be illegal, right? No, not particularly. Once again, let's look at what is the definition of personnel is. Everyone in the team area, players, substitutes, replaced players, coaches, athletic trainers, cheerleaders, band members, mascots, public address announcers, audio/video/lighting system operators, and other persons affiliated with the teams or institutions. So nowhere in Rule 1-11-H or in the definition of personnel does it state that the person doing the recording has to be in the coach's box. It just states that the person being recorded has to be in the coach's box. So they've got Michigan dead to rights on that. Michigan's best argument to avoid punishment here, if they were to take this to court, is a semantic argument about the definition of opposing and the phrasing of the actual rule that does admittedly seem to have an interpretation to where it could be interpreted as only referring to the two teams that are actually playing the game on the same field, because they wouldn't have much of an argument to argue that the recording isn't illegal through either the definition of bylaw 1-11-H or the definition of personnel, because in the definition of personnel, it specifically refers to anyone affiliated with the university's football team or other institution. So Michigan probably wouldn't be able to say that the person recording the sidelines is not affiliated with the university, and they would also not be able to say that the recording isn't illegal either. So their only argument, once again, is that they are not an opposing team because they're not playing the game that day. But that is a relatively flimsy argument, because the definition of both opposing and affiliated is not very strong, and you can't particularly interpret what that means through the actual text of the bylaws and rules. And there's a reason for that. If you don't think the NCAA can find lawyers that can write an airtight rule book where there is no questions about anything, if you don't think the NCAA could find and hire lawyers that can do that, then you're insane. The NCAA could absolutely do that if they wanted to, but they don't want to do that. They want all of this vagueness and gray areas and stuff like that, because when they launch an investigation, they have like a 99% chance of delivering infractions, and that's what they want. They want to be able to semantics their way into the university not having any sort of real defense if it were taken to a court of law. So they want all of that vagueness and all of these loose definitions and some stuff that doesn't particularly make a whole lot of sense in there. They want all of that in there so that they can make pretty much whatever argument that they want to make in order to ensure that a person or institution is punished if they want that person or institution to be punished. And if I'm being just honest with you, this is just my opinion right here. I think they want to be able to say the fact that we launched an investigation pretty much already means that you're guilty, because we don't take launching investigations lightly, and whenever we do launch investigations, they always end up in infractions, which is a pretty compelling case to have an argument against not malicious prosecution, because that's an actual like law, but effectively that, like a retaliatory sort of situation for somebody bitching about NCAA rules or saying stuff that the NCAA doesn't like. Okay, so I think I've covered everything surrounding the first rule that Michigan is effectively being accused of breaking. And this is the second one, Bylaw 11.6.1. Off-campus, in-person scouting of future opponents in the same season is prohibited, except as provided in Bylaws 11.6.1.1 and 11.6.1.2. Bylaw 11.6.1.1 reads, an institutional staff member may scout future opponents also participating in the same event at the same site. Basically what that means is if, for example, March Madness is happening and you have the Final Four teams that are all playing in the same court, the earlier team would be able to go to the later teams playing in order to see those two teams playing and scout them. That's basically saying that since there's nothing really better to do if you're at an actual venue than watch the other teams, we're going to allow that to happen. And Bylaw 11.6.1.2 reads, the institutional staff member may attend a contest in the institution's conference championship or in the NCAA championship contest in which a future opponent participates. Example, an opponent on the institution's spring non-championship segment scheduled participates in a fall conference or NCAA championship. Basically, that's saying that you can scout a future scheduled opponent even if they're in the same year, if it's a postseason contest. So, for example, if Texas and Georgia was the 4-versus-1 matchup, and Ohio State versus Florida State was the 2-versus-3 matchup, then Ohio State, since that game is usually played before the 1-versus-4 matchup, could send people even in person to go and scout that game because it is an NCAA championship contest. And the reason that I brought up Ohio State in that analogy is because this rule was added in this past offseason, specifically because Ohio State asked if they could send coaches to the Michigan TCU game, and the NCAA said yes. Neither of those exceptions have anything to do with Michigan or their case, but I wanted to tell you what they were because pretty much every article or video that I saw talking about this stated that there were 2 exceptions, but then never stated what they were. But the main thing here is that Bylaw 11.6.1 does not state that sending a third-party scout is not allowed. Now, nowhere in Bylaw 11.6.1 does it state what type of person is allowed or not allowed to attend these kind of games. However, Article 11 of the bylaws is titled Conduct and Employment of Athletics Personnel. So it is implied strongly that everything that starts with 11 point whatever is only referring to employees of the athletics departments of NCAA affiliated institutions. Therefore, a quote-unquote third-party individual would be anyone who is not directly employed by an institution or athletic department that is NCAA affiliated. And there is public proof out there. Pete Thamel and ESPN, I believe, wrote an entire article talking to one of the people who are actually recording video signals for Connor Stalions. And in that article, he stated that Connor Stalions paid him from his personal Venmo account. So that person would not be considered an employee of the athletic department of the University of Michigan. Now, that doesn't necessarily put Michigan off of the hook entirely. Because if it comes out that Connor Stalions was reimbursed financially for those expenses, then the NCAA could make a fairly reasonable argument that those people were then employed by the University of Michigan's athletic department. And I want to make this pretty clear. We have no clue if Connor Stalions was reimbursed for doing this. We have absolutely no idea. That being said, it would be pretty easy for the NCAA to figure out if he was or not. And if he was, then they could make a fairly convincing argument that these are more NCAA violations to go along with the violation of Rule 1-11-H that we talked about previously. However, given the way Michigan has talked about this, and this is just my opinion, and the sort of bravado that they've come out with and the fact that Jim Harbaugh and nobody else knew what was going on, I don't particularly think it's very likely that Connor Stalions was reimbursed financially for expenses he was incurring. But even if he was reimbursed, there still would be a path for Michigan to say both that the third-party scouting is legal and that reimbursing them is also okay. And this one's a little semantic-y, and we have to go backwards in time to 2013, because in August 2013, Bylaw 11.6.1 was different. In addition to banning schools from off-campus in-person scouting of opponents, it also stated a member institution shall not pay or permit the payment of expenses incurred in athletic department staff members or representatives, including professional scouting services, to scout its opponents or individuals who represent its opponents. Basically, the key part of that is including professional scouting services, because that's what third-party scouting is. However, then Bylaw 11.6.2 stated that football, basketball, and women's volleyball had a carve out from that part of the rule, and that rule did not affect those three sports. Again, them being football, basketball, and women's volleyball, meaning that those three sports could hire a third-party scouting service to scout future opponents and reimburse them. In August of 2013, the bylaw was reworked for the sake of simplicity. Basically, they made it what it is now for every sport, as opposed to having a specific carve out for three of them. And the new bylaw doesn't talk about third-party scouting services at all, effectively meaning that before the bylaw was changed in 2013, football teams could send third-party or professional scouting services to future opponents to scout their games for them and reimburse them. And afterwards, it was also legal and perfectly acceptable to do so, because the bylaw didn't change that rule. It just got rid of the section that stated that third-party scouting was only allowed for three different sports. So just like with the violation of Rule 1-11-H, where they've got Michigan dead to rights on it, in my opinion, I don't think there's any real scenario where they can punish Michigan for having third-party scouts at games. Now, whether or not Connor Stallions was on the sidelines for that Central Michigan versus Michigan State game is another question entirely, because that would very obviously be a violation of this rule. However, it would likely still only be against him, because unless they can find written and documented proof that Jim Harbaugh or another member of the Michigan staff ordered him to go to that game, they likely wouldn't be able to pin it on anybody else. And the NCAA has stated in recent years that it is focusing on punishing individuals rather than institutions and groups, especially if the infracting individual or institution is no longer employed by that school or university. So, to summarize here a little bit, stuff that is explicitly allowed: the sharing of signs between coaches, third-person scouting, and reimbursement. There is no rule that suggests that adding up all the factors surrounding this Michigan case and all of the gray areas that they seem to be operating in would make something illegal. So basically, if Michigan somehow managed to skirt the law around all of this on purpose, there is no rule that suggests that purposely trying to exploit gray areas or inconsistencies or stuff like that would be a violation. And the last thing here is that sending scouts to games against teams that are not on your schedule this season is not illegal. So if Michigan was sending third-party scouts or even in-person coaching staff members to go and see Clemson in 2022, or Tennessee in 2022, or Alabama and Georgia and Florida State, and Oregon and Washington this year, it would not be illegal, because those are not scheduled opponents. So let's go back to that first thing here, sharing signs between coaches, and let's kind of break down all of these things a little bit more. The number one thing about sharing signs with other coaches is that it happens all the time. And there have been articles and reports about Ohio State and Rutgers sharing signs with Purdue for the Big Ten Championship in 2022. That's not illegal. And I never particularly felt like any of the Michigan arguments that I heard on Twitter from respectable individuals were coping, so to speak, until I heard that. And then I was like, yeah, no, that's full-blown cope. And trying to make the argument that then Ohio State and Rutgers were somehow acting as advanced in-person scouts for Purdue in those games is absurd. And I don't particularly think that's a very good argument. When it comes to the NCAA violations, it may be relevant for the Big Ten, which is what we're going to talk about next. But for right now, let's stick with the NCAA stuff. Next on the list here, third-person scouting and reimbursement. So that does not seem to be illegal. And it is a little bit semantic, and you do have to read into things that are not the letter of the rule. However, the letter of the rule does not explicitly say that it is illegal either. So having the semantics of it or the context of it in your favor is something that the University of Michigan is happy about. And Connor Stallion sending third-party scouts to these games, even if they were against scheduled opponents, is not illegal unless they were videoing the sidelines. But that is a violation of Rule 1-11-H, not Bylaw 11.6.1. And finally, there is no rule that suggests that combining all of these different factors and gray areas and potential skirting around the laws, and even probably a rule being broken, would somehow make this punishment more severe. All of that being said, everything we've talked about so far is only applicable to the NCAA investigation, not the Big Ten and their suspension of Jim Harbaugh. This past Friday night, the Big Ten announced that Jim Harbaugh was going to be suspended until the end of the regular season, which is a 3-game suspension, meaning that Petitti, the Big Ten commissioner, had to get approval from the athletic directors of the Big Ten Conference, which I believe he did get. All that being said, his decision to suspend Jim Harbaugh like this, in the manner that he did, was absolutely horrible. And his reasoning for suspending Jim Harbaugh is even worse. His reasoning for suspending Jim Harbaugh was that the Advanced In-Person Scouting Network broke the Big Ten sportsmanship policy and provided an unfair competitive advantage to the University of Michigan. Also on Friday night, Michigan filed for a TRO, or a temporary restraining order. Effectively, a TRO is just a restriction on any punishment that can be handed out in a civil sort of sense until such a time that the case itself can be adjudicated in court. Typically, we only think of restraining orders in the sense of like an abusive boyfriend. So the girlfriend gets a restraining order on him and he can't come within like 500 feet of her or something like that. But effectively, all a restraining order is in order to restrain something. And what is being restricted here is the punishment that would be applied to the University of Michigan and Jim Harbaugh. So Michigan's argument for getting a TRO is going to be two-factored. The first factor being that the Big Ten is claiming that they are not punishing Jim Harbaugh as an individual, but are instead punishing the University of Michigan by suspending their head coach. And that's not what's going on here, okay? Any rational reading of this in terms of like context and what is actually going on, everybody knows that the Big Ten and all the Big Ten coaches are going after Jim Harbaugh. They're not going after Michigan. They don't care about Michigan. They're going after Jim Harbaugh. It's pretty obvious to me that the goal is to get Jim Harbaugh away from the University of Michigan. And I'm not so sure that has pretty much anything to do with Michigan's success on the field. And I think it has more to do with the fact that Jim Harbaugh is an extraordinarily abrasive individual. And to the Michigan fan listening to this, I hope you're also a Detroit Pistons fan, because I'm going to give you an analogy here. Before Blake Griffin got to Detroit, he was one of the most hated athletes in all of professional sports because he was kind of an asshole and he played somewhat dirty. Then when he came to Detroit, all of a sudden all the people in Detroit loved him and they're like, oh, that's Bad Boys Pistons era stuff and we love all that kind of shit here. And then he got traded to the Nets and we went right back to being annoyed by Blake Griffin and everything that he does. And Blake Griffin is effectively Jim Harbaugh in this scenario. Jim Harbaugh is a very, very dickish personality. I'm not saying that he's a bad person or anything like that, but if you listen to him and everything that he says with an objective sort of lens and you take the maize and blues glasses off, you can see why people would find him annoying and kind of dickish. And it also doesn't help that he very much stands on his principles and believes what he says and doesn't particularly take crap from anybody. So when you combine all of these factors in here, it does not make for the type of personality that is popular amongst people. So Michigan in the TRO hearing is that the Big Ten's purpose in suspending Jim Harbaugh was not to punish the University of Michigan, but instead to punish Jim Harbaugh. And they have some pretty seriously compelling type of stuff to be able to present to court that that's what's going on here, including a video conference between Commissioner Petitti and 13 other head coaches where all they did was bitch about Jim Harbaugh. So step one, so to speak, here, I think will be accomplished fairly easily. The second step would then be to prove, now that we've proven that the Big Ten is going after Jim Harbaugh and not the university, Jim Harbaugh is completely innocent and there's no allegation stating that he knew anything about this. And that argument is self-given because the Big Ten has already admitted that Jim Harbaugh didn't know anything about this. They admitted that when they stated that they were not punishing Jim Harbaugh as an individual, but instead were punishing the University of Michigan by suspending its head coach. So step one and step two are tethered together. If Michigan fails in proving step one, then step two doesn't matter. And if Michigan proves step one, then step two is a formality. So what do I think this is going to happen? I think the TRO is going to get granted on Friday, this upcoming Friday. I think it's very likely the TRO is going to get granted. However, Michigan has absolutely no chance of winning an actual court case in this event because the Big Ten, whether they want to admit it or not, them being the University of Michigan, has the absolute authority to suspend Jim Harbaugh for any fucking reason they want to, as long as they state that it violated the sportsmanship policy. So Michigan would have to prove that what they did not violate the sportsmanship policy, and they have no chance of doing that, mainly because they're being investigated by the NCAA for breaking the rules, which would also mean unsportsmanlike conduct. So once again, the goal for Michigan is not to skirt around the law. They're going to make some other arguments, by the way. They're going to talk about how procedure wasn't followed. It was. They're just trying to do whatever the fuck they can to stop Jim Harbaugh from getting suspended for the postseason and everything like that. Effectively, what they want to do is to get the TRO injunction and then delay the court proceedings long enough to where it's the end of the season, and then they'll probably drop the case. Now, one thing I don't know is if the Big Ten can still come out and say Jim Harbaugh has to serve his 2-game suspension, even if the season has ended, even if the regular season has ended, rather, because they might have to do that, in which case the worst case of this would be that Michigan would have to take this to court, and then all of a sudden Jim Harbaugh is potentially suspended for the bowl game or the college football playoff games. So I don't know if that's what's going to happen, but it is certainly on the table that the Big Ten would be petty enough to make Jim Harbaugh serve those 2 games in the postseason or at the beginning of next season. So with the Big Ten stuff out of the way here, let's go ahead and pivot here to talking about the potential NCAA punishments, starting by figuring out what factors are here. So I think the NCAA is fairly likely to finish their investigations sometime in like March, April, and deliver Michigan with a notice of allegations. I think this is such a high-profile case. They're going to put this at the top of their list and probably try to finish this as quickly as possible. So there are several factors involved in deciding what kind of punishment is going to be handed out. And some of those factors are, is Jim Harbaugh still employed by the University of Michigan? Also, it's worth noting that since Connor Stalions is no longer employed by the University of Michigan, that is also a factor. Something that could also potentially affect the punishment here is the investigative firm. And again, I want to reiterate here, the fact that an investigative firm gave information to the NCAA that kickstarted this whole ordeal is relatively irrelevant. However, when it comes to punishments, the NCAA might pull back a little bit if it turns out that that investigative firm was hired by a college football team or coach or someone affiliated with an athletics program. And also another thing here, I don't particularly think it matters who that coach or team or athletics program or, booster potentially is. I don't think it matters if they're an Ohio State fan or a Georgia fan or a Michigan State fan or whatever. I think the only thing that particularly matters is that the NCAA might not want to set the precedent that hiring an investigative firm to look into another team is something that can be acceptable. However, I think it's equally as likely that the NCAA just doesn't give a fuck about it and it doesn't affect anything. The next thing that's a factor here is the actual infractions and what level they're going to be. Now, we're going to go into more detail on what level I think all of these different infractions are going to be, but the number of them is going to also be a factor and level up the punishment, in my opinion. Another factor is who knew. If Connor Stalions was in fact a rogue agent or a rogue coach, as some people have been saying, and Michigan can verifiably prove that nobody else did, and I do think that that is somewhat likely because they've come out with a crap load of bravado being like Jim Harbaugh didn't know about this, and if Jim Harbaugh didn't know, the likelihood of another coach knowing is also fairly unlikely in my opinion. So if nobody knew, the chances of coming down hard on the actual university or anybody other than Jim Harbaugh is significantly lower. And the last thing that could potentially affect the punishment here is the timetable. If this gets done in March/April, which is when I believe it will get done, then Michigan pretty much isn't going to have enough time to self-impose any potential punishments that would maybe lessen the actual punishments that the NCAA gives them. Because typically when you see self-imposed punishments after a notice of allegations, it's because they don't want whatever the NCAA is actually going to give them. So they kind of just say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and it's going to hurt, but it's not going to hurt as much as what the NCAA is going to do if in a year or two from now, they actually come down and take some stuff away from us. So what are the most likely punishments, in my opinion? I think the most likely punishments are going to be fines and suspensions for Jim Harbaugh specifically, potentially a bowl game ban. And I do think Michigan is going to get some form of a probationary period as well. To go along with that, Connor Stalions is almost certainly going to receive a show cause order, meaning that if he were to be hired by another college football team and be part of their coaching staff, he would have to show them why he resigned or was fired from his previous job. And the NCAA might also impose punishments on the team that is hiring him because he has a show cause order. So Connor Stalions will never work in college football again. That, I think we can pretty much all say, is the reality of this situation. The last thing we're going to do in this little segment here is talk about the recording rule that was actually broken and whether or not that will be a level 3, level 2, or level 1 violation. What I think is, I don't think there's any case where this is a level 3 violation. Like, I don't think that Michigan could make an argument that the advantage that recording the sidelines to get 100% of the signs that were signaled in during a game is a minimal advantage. I don't think you can make that argument. However, I don't particularly think there's a great argument to say that that's a level 1 violation either. Now, if the NCAA were to come out and say that each time that a third-party scout pointed the camera at the opposing team's bench to record the signs was a level 1 violation, in which case Michigan would have like 100 level 1 violations. And if they were to do that, I think that Michigan would take them to court. And I think they would have a fairly good chance of getting it knocked down to a level 2 violation, because Michigan would be able to go out and say, hey, everybody steals signs, and if you can steal signs in a way that still gets you 100% of our signs, which they say they have proof of, and we've seen some proof of other teams having Michigan signs, then the advantage that was gained was not substantial enough to warrant a level 1 violation, because the only real definition that we have of a level 3, level 2, or level 1 violation is that a level 3 violation is something that was intended to give or gave a minimal advantage. And a level 1 violation is something that was intended to give or gave a substantial advantage. We have no definition of what minimal or substantial is, so it would just be up to the judge to kind of figure out, based upon the greater context of what level 1 violations and what level 3 violations have been given out for in the history of college football. I personally think that this is a textbook example of a level 2 violation. That being something that was intended to give or gave a more than minimal but less than substantial advantage. Because effectively, what this comes down to is if Michigan can prove that other teams got their signals as well, then Michigan using perhaps a potentially illegal manner to make the stealing of signs more efficient would not be a substantial advantage, but it certainly would not be a minimal advantage either. The reason it wouldn't be a substantial advantage is because if the other team has the same amount or perhaps just slightly less of an amount of signs on you as you have on them, then it's not a particularly large advantage. So I think, and it's just my opinion, but I think that this is a clear case of a level 2 violation for having a third-party scout film the sidelines of a future opponent. Now, do I still think a level 1 violation is on the table for that? Yeah, probably. But I think a level 3 violation is also on the table for that. I think that it is probably like 10% it's a level 1 violation, 10% it's a level 3 violation, and like 80% it's a level 2 violation. But here's the thing. Each time somebody recorded the sidelines of a game, that is its own individual level 2 violation. So if Michigan scouted, we'll say, just because it's a nice even number, 30 games of future scheduled opponents per year by sending an advanced scout to record their sidelines, then those would be 30 individual level 2 violations. Those would go back the past 2 years, making 60 individual level 2 violations. The reason that you can't go back to 2021 and make this 90 level 2 violations is because Connor Stalions was not employed by the University of Michigan. Therefore, he is not subjective Bylaw 11.6.1. And if he was personally doing the recording of the sidelines and games, etc., and then volunteering that information to somebody on the Michigan coaching staff, since he is not an employee of the University of Michigan, then the enforcement of Rule 1-11-8 also becomes a little bit muddy. And whether or not they can actually do that is a little bit weird. Because then, hypothetically, if a football coach came home and watched ESPN or whatever and saw a former coach giving a breakdown of the matchup coming up in here, and he says that since this team runs a lot of man-to-man, you have to run crossing routes, and then he decided to take that information, he being the coach watching ESPN, decided to take that information and use it as part of his game plan, then that would be a violation of that rule. So that opens up a whole lot of muddy kind of stuff that I don't particularly think the NCAA wants to get into. So what I think is likely going to be the outcome of all of this, in addition to the probation and a potential bowl game ban or a postseason ban for 1 year, which I think is the most Michigan is going to face, I think Jim Harbaugh is also fairly likely to be suspended 1 to 3 games for lack of institutional control as a level 2 violation, because I don't know where this came from, by the way, but I saw on X or Twitter or whatever the fuck you want to call it, that a lot of people were saying lack of institutional control is an automatic level 1 violation. It isn't. Lack of institutional control can be a level 3, level 2, or level 1 violation depending upon how severe it is. So again, I think this would be a level 2 violation, and Jim Harbaugh would likely be looking down the barrel of a 1 to 3 game suspension. I think the University of Michigan would likely get a hefty fine from the NCAA and a public reprimand, which it's basically already gotten. I also think that the vacation of the entirety of the 2022 season and the first 7 games of the 2023 season is on the table and fairly likely. The reason it's only probably going to be the first 7 games of this season is because Connor Stalions was away from the football team after week 7. So I think if they tried to take the whole year away, I think Michigan would also, again, take them to court over that. And I don't think the NCAA particularly wants that to happen. However, it is possible they just take away the entire 2023 season as well. That's fairly likely, although I think it's less likely than just the first 7 games. So, what would I do if I was controlling the University of Michigan's response to all of this? By the way, if you're not a Michigan fan, the video's effectively over. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing, like the video, leave a comment, all that good stuff. But if you are a fan of the University of Michigan, this is what I'm going to tell you what I would be doing to try and limit the damage here. And what I would do is that I would hope and pray that the NCAA investigation ends this offseason and I get the notice of allegations. I would respond instantly and self-impose a one-year postseason ban and give up those 20 games and hope that that is enough to satiate the NCAA into not suspending Jim Harbaugh. That's what I would do, at least when it comes to the NCAA. As far as the Big Ten goes and what I would do with the Big Ten, I'm going to tell you straight up what I would do with the Big Ten. And what I would have done this Friday, I would have announced that effective immediately, the University of Michigan's football program is no longer part of the Big Ten, and therefore Commissioner Petitti has no authority to suspend Jim Harbaugh whatsoever. So, is that sacrificing a chance at a Big Ten championship? Yes, absolutely. I personally do not give a fuck. Because if we go 12-0, we're going to make the goddamn playoffs as an independent team anyway. Okay? So that's what matters to me, not the Big Ten championship. I don't give a fuck about the Big Ten championship. I would then get on the horn with all three of the other Power 4 conferences and say, yo, who wants me? Now, I think the conference that makes the most sense for Michigan to join would be the ACC. They're currently sitting at 15 teams, which is an odd number, and unlike the SEC, Michigan would unequivocally be the biggest brand and likely the top dog in the ACC. Now, you can also say that about the Big 12. However, the problem with joining the new-look Big 12 is that the Big 12 has exactly 0 top 20 brands in college football. So even if Michigan were to join, they wouldn't particularly mean a whole lot, and Michigan would likely be taking a severe discount in terms of television money. But I think the ACC does have at least one top 10 brand in Florida State and other brands that have the potential to jump into that top 10 conversation. Those being Virginia Tech, Miami, potentially Clemson if they can get going again, potentially Georgia Tech, and potentially North Carolina as well. And for the basketball aspect of this, North Carolina and Duke are two massive basketball programs, and Michigan has a respectable basketball team with a lot of good history. So I think the best place for Michigan to go, if it isn't the Big Ten, is the ACC. But that's just me. And what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. So at this point, I'd like to say thank you for watching the video. Go ahead and drop a like if you liked the video. Subscribe if you want to see more in-depth content like this. And if you disagreed with me at any point, or if you just have something to say, go ahead and leave a comment down in the comment section below. And with the outro out of the way, I'd like to say have a good day, and I'll see you next time.